John Titor materialized in online discussion forums with an extraordinary claim that would have gotten him laughed off the internet if not for what happened next. He wasn't just another conspiracy theorist or attention-seeking hoaxer. He was, according to his posts, a soldier from the year 2036 sent back in time on a military mission to retrieve specific computer technology from 1975. But his mission had brought him through our timeline, and he decided to share what he knew about our immediate future. What made Titor different from every other alleged time traveler was the sheer volume and specificity of information he provided. He didn't just make vague predictions about coming changes. He delivered technical blueprints for his time machine, explained the mechanics of temporal displacement using advanced physics, and described the socio-political landscape of the early 21st century with an accuracy that becomes more chilling with each passing year. Writing between 2000 and 2001, months before September 11th changed everything, Titor warned that Americans would willingly surrender constitutional freedoms in exchange for security after experiencing domestic terrorism on an unprecedented scale. He described a future where federal police actions would increase dramatically, where surveillance would become pervasive, and where the country would split along urban and rural lines in ways that seemed impossible during the relatively peaceful Clinton years. His technical knowledge was equally impressive and equally impossible to explain. He accurately described capabilities of the IBM 5100 computer that weren't publicly known until years after his posts disappeared. When questioned about specific technical details, he provided information that computer engineers later confirmed was correct, but wasn't available in public documentation when he was posting. A former IBM engineer named Bob Dubker later verified that only a handful of people knew about these hidden functions when Titor was active online. But it was his predictions about technology that truly set him apart from typical internet prophets. In 2000, when most people were still using dial-up modems and carrying pagers, Titor described a world where everyone would carry powerful computers in their pockets. He talked about global communication networks that would allow instant contact with anyone on Earth, social media platforms that would reshape human interaction, and information systems so advanced they would fundamentally alter how society operates. He wasn't describing these as distant possibilities or science fiction concepts. He was describing them as historical facts from his perspective, technologies that were already outdated in his 2036 timeline. His descriptions of smartphones, social networking, and internet-based commerce were so accurate they read like product reviews written 15 years before those products existed. Perhaps most disturbing of all were his warnings about the psychological and social costs of these technological advances. Writing in 2001, he predicted that these communication technologies would create new forms of addiction and social isolation, that people would become dependent on constant digital stimulation, and that real-world human connections would deteriorate as virtual connections multiplied. Anyone living in 2024 can see how precisely these predictions materialized. Titor's posts also contained ominous warnings about political polarization in America. He described a second civil war beginning around 2005, sparked by federal overreach and constitutional violations following a major terrorist attack. While his timeline was compressed, the social divisions he predicted between urban and rural populations, the rise of federal police powers, and the gradual erosion of constitutional protections have manifested with startling accuracy over the past 2 decades. His understanding of physics was equally advanced for someone posting in internet forums. He explained concepts related to quantum mechanics, parallel universes, and temporal mechanics with a sophistication that impressed physicists who encountered his posts. His descriptions of how time travel would work incorporated many worlds, interpretation of quantum physics, and addressed paradox problems in ways that wouldn't become mainstream theoretical discussion for years afterward. The photographs he provided showed what appeared to be his time travel device installed in a 1987 Chevrolet Suburban, The images demonstrated technical sophistication that would have been extremely difficult to fabricate convincingly in 2000. The device appeared to be a complex arrangement of electromagnetic field generators with detailed technical specifications that suggested genuine engineering rather than science fiction props. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, John Titor vanished from the forums in March 2001. His final post stated that his mission was complete and he would be leaving this timeline shortly. He thanked the online communities that had engaged with him and warned that the future he described wasn't inevitable, that individual choices and collective actions could still alter the trajectory he had witnessed. 23 years later, the accuracy of Titor's predictions becomes more unsettling with each news cycle. The surveillance state he described has materialized exactly as he warned. The social media platforms he predicted have reshaped civilization in precisely the ways he outlined. The political polarization and constitutional erosion he forecast have accelerated beyond what even pessimists imagined possible in 2001. Skeptics argue that Titor was simply an astute observer of emerging trends who packaged educated guesses in an entertaining time travel narrative. They point out that some of his more dramatic predictions, like open civil war by 2015, didn't materialize exactly as described. But supporters counter that his core insights about technology, society, and politics have proven remarkably prescient, and that his timeline might have been affected by his own intervention in our past. What makes the Titor case particularly compelling is not just the accuracy of individual predictions, but the comprehensive worldview he presented. He didn't just guess that smartphones would be invented. He described an entire technological and social ecosystem that wouldn't emerge for more than a decade, complete with psychological effects and societal consequences that are now undeniably real. The investigation into Titor's true identity has revealed tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. Some evidence points to an elaborate hoax orchestrated by entertainment lawyers in Florida, but the technical knowledge displayed in his posts suggests involvement by someone with advanced computer science and physics expertise. The sheer volume of detailed, consistent information provided over 2 years of posting indicates either an extraordinarily sophisticated hoax or something far more extraordinary. Our next case takes us from the digital realm into physical reality, where documented evidence challenges our understanding of how past and present can intersect in impossible ways. In the summer of 1950, New York City witnessed something that would haunt investigators for decades and force them to question the very nature of reality itself. What started as a routine traffic accident in Times Square became one of the most documented cases of temporal displacement ever recorded, complete with physical evidence that defies every rational explanation. The victim was a man named Rudolph Fentz, struck and killed by a taxi on a busy Thursday evening in June. Under normal circumstances, this would have been just another tragic statistic in a city where pedestrian accidents were unfortunately common. But when police searched the body, they discovered something that turned a simple traffic fatality into an impossible mystery that challenges everything we think we know about time. Fentz was dressed in clothing that belonged in a different century. He wore a black frock coat, button-up boots, and a vest with a gold pocket watch, all appearing to be from the 1870s. Yet these weren't costume pieces or vintage reproductions. The clothing showed no signs of age, wear, or the kind of deterioration you'd expect from 80-year-old garments. Everything looked brand new, as if it had just been tailored. His pockets contained items that deepened the mystery exponentially. There were brass buttons, a copper token for a free beer at a tavern that had been demolished in 1876, and $70 in banknotes that had been out of circulation for decades. Most puzzling was what he didn't have. No identification from the modern era, no wallet contents connecting him to 1950, and no signs of mental illness or confusion that might explain his anachronistic appearance. Witnesses described Fentz as looking around Times Square with complete bewilderment, as if seeing the modern cityscape for the first time. His behavior suggested someone genuinely disoriented by his surroundings, rather than someone playing an elaborate practical joke. He stepped directly into traffic as if unaware of how dangerous automobiles could be, moving with the careful deliberation of someone unfamiliar with modern transportation. Captain Hubert Rhyme of the Missing Persons Bureau decided to investigate what should have been an open and shut case. What he discovered in the department's old records defied every law of logic and causality. In the missing persons files from 1876, he found an entry for Rudolph Fentz, aged 29, who had vanished without a trace during an evening walk near his home. The description matched the accident victim perfectly, down to the smallest physical details. Height, weight, hair color, facial features, even specific scars and birthmarks aligned exactly between the 1876 missing person and the 1950 traffic fatality. The mathematical probability of such precise physical correspondence occurring by chance approaches statistical impossibility. Rhyme's investigation revealed even more disturbing evidence. In the 1939 New York phone directory, there was a listing for Rudolph Fentz Jr. When contacted, this man claimed his father had mysteriously disappeared in 1876 during a routine evening walk and was never seen again. He provided a photograph of his missing father that was identical to the man killed in Times Square, creating a generational connection that spans nearly 3/4 of a century. The physical evidence presented problems that forensic science couldn't adequately explain. The clothing, while appearing to be from the 1870s, showed no signs of aging, moth damage, or the chemical deterioration that would be inevitable after decades of storage. The fabric retained dyes and textures that suggested recent manufacture, yet the styles and construction methods were authentically Victorian. The banknotes presented their own impossibilities. Currency experts confirmed they were genuine legal tender from the appropriate historical period, not reproductions or collector's items. Yet the bills showed minimal wear, despite supposedly being carried for 74 years. The paper quality and printing characteristics matched 1870s Treasury standards perfectly, but the preservation state suggested recent printing rather than antique currency. Most disturbing was the copper beer token, which bore the name of a tavern that had operated in Lower Manhattan during the 1870s. Historical records confirmed the establishment's existence and its demolition in 1876, but the token itself appeared newly minted rather than aged. Metallurgical analysis revealed copper composition and manufacturing techniques consistent with 19th century methods, yet without the corrosion and wear patterns expected from a token carried for decades. The case was quietly filed away and forgotten by official channels, deemed too strange and inexplicable for public consumption. But retired police officers who worked the investigation continued to discuss it privately for decades afterward. They had witnessed physical evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about time, causality, and the nature of reality itself. Medical examination of Fentz's body revealed additional anomalies that deepened the mystery. His dental work was consistent with 19th century techniques, using materials and methods that had been abandoned by modern dentistry. His physical condition suggested someone accustomed to the lifestyle and diet of the 1870s rather than mid-20th century living. Even his callus patterns and muscle development indicated manual labour typical of the Victorian era. The psychological profile, constructed from witness statements, painted a picture of genuine temporal displacement rather than elaborate deception. Fentz exhibited none of the behavioural markers associated with mental illness, drug intoxication, or deliberate fraud. His reactions to modern Times Square suggested authentic amazement and confusion rather than performed bewilderment. What makes the Fentz case particularly compelling is the convergence of multiple independent evidence streams. The missing persons report from 1876, the physical evidence from 1950, and the testimony from his descendant in 1939 create a triangle of documentation that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. Each piece of evidence supports the others in ways that suggest genuine temporal anomaly rather than coordinated hoax. Skeptics have attempted to explain the case through conventional means, proposing everything from elaborate practical jokes to cases of mistaken identity involving historical reenactors. However, none of these explanations adequately account for the physical evidence, the historical documentation, or the precise correspondence between the missing person from 1876 and the accident victim from 1950. The fence incident represents something far more disturbing than simple time travel. It suggests that individuals can become unstuck from their proper temporal location and transported across decades with their physical forms intact, but their context completely disrupted. The case implies that time might not be the fixed, linear progression we assume, but something far more fluid and unpredictable. Our third case takes us across the Atlantic to the Gardens of Versailles, where two respected academics experienced something that would challenge their understanding of history, reality, and the boundaries between past and present. What they witnessed during a simple afternoon walk would become one of the most thoroughly documented and credible cases of temporal displacement ever recorded. In August 1901, Eleanor Jourdain and Charlotte Moberly, both distinguished scholars from Oxford, decided to explore the famous gardens surrounding the Palace of Versailles during a vacation in France. Both women were highly educated, skeptical by nature, and trained in rigorous academic methodology. They approached their afternoon stroll with the same intellectual curiosity they brought to their scholarly work. What began as a leisurely tourist excursion became an encounter with the past so vivid and detailed that it would consume both women for the next decade as they attempted to verify and understand what they had experienced. The evidence they gathered would challenge conventional understanding of time, memory, and historical reality in ways that continue to baffle researchers more than a century later. As they walked through the gardens, both women began to notice subtle changes in their environment that defied logical explanation. The atmosphere became oppressive and dreamlike, as if they had stepped through an invisible barrier into a different realm entirely. Colours around them seemed to fade and take on the muted tones of an old painting. An inexplicable feeling of melancholy settled over them, accompanied by a sensation that they were being watched by unseen observers. The first concrete evidence that something extraordinary was happening came when they encountered people dressed in elaborate 18th century clothing who seemed to be going about their daily activities as if nothing unusual was occurring. These weren't costumed tour guides or historical reenactors. The individuals they met moved with the natural confidence of people in their proper time and place, completely unaware that anything strange was happening. Near the Petit Trianon, they observed a woman sitting on the grass, sketching with focused concentration. She looked up at them with mild curiosity, before returning to her artistic work. The woman's clothing, hairstyle, and overall appearance matched historical descriptions of Marie Antoinette with uncanny precision. More importantly, the location where they encountered her was exactly where historical records indicated the doomed queen would spend her summer afternoons during the final years before the French Revolution. The architectural environment they observed presented equally impossible evidence. Buildings that had been demolished decades before 1901 appeared solid and functional. Gardens that had been redesigned multiple times since the 18th century displayed their original 1789 layout with perfect accuracy. Paths that no longer existed in their time period stretched before them, as if freshly maintained by royal groundskeepers. They encountered gardeners working with tools that belonged to a different century, using techniques and equipment that had been abandoned by modern landscape maintenance. The workers acknowledged their presence with the casual politeness typical of servants accustomed to encountering nobility and visitors in the royal gardens. None seemed surprised by the appearance of two English women in Victorian dress. Most striking was their interaction with a man in a dark cloak who warned them away from a certain direction with urgent gestures. They would later realize this individual bore an exact resemblance to the Comte de Vaudreuil, one of Marie Antoinette's courtiers whose detailed portraits survived in historical archives. His clothing, mannerisms, and even his facial features matched documented descriptions with photographic precision. When they returned to their hotel that evening, both women were profoundly shaken by what they had experienced. Being trained academics, they immediately began a systematic investigation that would consume the next decade of their lives. They interviewed historians, studied 18th century maps of Versailles, and compared their memories against historical records with the same rigor they applied to their university research. What they discovered was even more unsettling than their original experience. Every detail they had observed could be verified as historically accurate to the summer of 1789, just months before the French Revolution would sweep away the world they had apparently visited. Their knowledge of architectural details, garden layouts, and specific individuals corresponded exactly to private archives that weren't publicly available in 1901. The paths they had walked matched historical plans stored in restricted collections. The buildings they had seen existed precisely as described in confidential palace records. Even the placement of specific trees and garden features aligned with 18th century landscaping documents that required special permission to access. Their descriptions demonstrated knowledge that would have been impossible to acquire through conventional research methods available at the time. Most compelling was their separate documentation of the experience. Without consulting each other, both women wrote detailed accounts of what they had witnessed, then compared their independent recollections. The correspondence was remarkable, not just in broad details, but in minute specifics that suggested they had genuinely shared the same impossible experience rather than influenced each other's memories. The French authorities took their claims seriously enough to launch their own investigation. Official researchers confirmed that the women had accurately described features of Versailles that had existed in 1789 but had been changed or removed by 1901. The precision of their historical knowledge impressed even skeptical government officials, who had initially dismissed their account as tourist fantasy or academic delusion. Independent verification came from architectural historians who found that Jourdain and Moberly had described structural details that appeared in no public documents but were confirmed by private palace records. Their account included information about room layouts, decorative elements, and even specific furniture arrangements that matched archived inventories from the period they claimed to have visited. The psychological profiles of both women added credibility to their extraordinary claims. Neither had histories of mental illness, substance abuse, or tendency toward fantasy. Both were respected academics with reputations for rigorous scholarship and critical thinking. Their colleagues at Oxford confirmed that they approached this investigation with the same methodical skepticism they applied to their professional work. What made their case particularly compelling was the emotional authenticity of their experience. Both women described feeling genuine sadness and foreboding while in the past, emotions that aligned perfectly with the historical moment they claimed to have witnessed. They had encountered Marie Antoinette during her final summer of relative freedom, just months before the revolution would destroy her world forever. The sensory details they recorded suggested direct experience rather than imaginative reconstruction. They described specific sounds, smells, and tactile sensations that indicated physical presence in the 18th century environment. The quality of light, the texture of gravel paths, even the particular fragrance of period gardens were documented with precision that suggested genuine sensory memory rather than historical speculation. Skeptics attempted to explain their experience through conventional psychology, proposing everything from shared hallucination to cryptomnesia, where forgotten historical knowledge resurfaces as apparent memory. However, none of these explanations adequately accounted for the specific accuracy of their observations, or the independent verification of details that weren't available through normal research channels. The publication of their account in 1911 sparked international debate among psychologists, historians, and philosophers. Supporters argued that their academic credentials and methodical investigation demanded serious consideration. Critics maintained that no amount of scholarly rigor could validate such an impossible claim, regardless of the evidence presented. But the physical evidence remained stubbornly inexplicable. Their impossible knowledge of 18th century Versailles, verified through multiple independent sources, suggested they had somehow accessed information that existed only in the past itself. Whether through time travel, psychic vision, or some unknown mechanism, they had encountered historical reality with a precision that conventional explanation cannot adequately address. Our fourth case brings us to the realm of literature and prophecy, where creative imagination intersected with future tragedy in ways so precise they challenge our understanding of how fiction relates to reality. What happened here involves one of America's greatest writers and a prediction so specific it would later be dismissed as impossible coincidence, except the details are too exact for mathematical comfort. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only complete novel, a maritime adventure called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. The book contained a gruesome scene that would prove prophetic in the most disturbing way imaginable. Poe described 4 shipwrecked sailors, starving and desperate on a lifeboat, making the horrific decision to resort to cannibalism for survival. In Poe's fictional account, the men drew lots to determine who would be sacrificed to save the others. The victim was a young cabin boy named Richard Parker, who was killed and consumed by his 3 companions. It was dark fiction from the mind of America's master of macabre literature, designed to explore the psychological extremes of human desperation and moral collapse. 46 years later, reality would mirror Poe's imagination with precision so chilling it defies every rational explanation for coincidence. In 1884, an English yacht called the Mignonette set sail from Southampton bound for Sydney, Australia. During the voyage, the vessel encountered a massive storm in the South Atlantic and sank, leaving 4 crew members adrift in a small lifeboat with virtually no supplies. The survivors were Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and 17-year-old cabin boy Richard Parker. Yes, you heard that name correctly. Richard Parker, the exact same name as Poe's fictional victim, written nearly half a century before this real tragedy, would unfold in the middle of the ocean. Adrift for weeks with no food and minimal fresh water, the 4 men grew increasingly desperate. They managed to catch an occasional turtle, but it wasn't nearly enough to sustain them. The young cabin boy, Richard Parker, became ill after drinking seawater in his desperation. Seeing that the boy was near death, Captain Dudley proposed the unthinkable. They should kill Richard Parker and consume his body to save themselves. After agonizing debate, they committed the act exactly as Poe had described in his fictional account. Parker was killed, and the remaining 3 men fed on his corpse. They were rescued just days later by a passing ship, thousands of miles from any land. The subsequent legal case became a landmark in English law, establishing the precedent that necessity is not a legal defense for murder. The parallels between Poe's fiction and the real Mignonette disaster are so precise, they push the boundaries of statistical possibility into supernatural territory. Both involved 4 men on a lifeboat. Both featured a cabin boy named Richard Parker as the victim. Both described identical circumstances leading to cannibalism. Both occurred in the same general ocean region under nearly identical conditions. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Poe had no possible way of knowing these specific details would manifest in reality decades later. He couldn't have predicted that someone with the precise name of his fictional victim would find himself in identical circumstances facing the same horrific fate. Yet somehow his dark imagination became prophetic reality with surgical accuracy that defies rational explanation. The mathematical odds of this specific name appearing in both the fictional and real versions of this exact scenario are beyond astronomical. Poe created Richard Parker from his imagination in 1838. The real Richard Parker was born years after the novel was published, given a name that would later seal his fate in circumstances identical to those Poe had invented. This coincidence forces us to confront deeply unsettling questions about the relationship between imagination and reality. Can creative minds sometimes access information about future events through mechanisms we don't understand? Do certain tragic patterns repeat themselves across time with mathematical precision? Or did Poe somehow tap into a darker truth about human nature that made his fictional scenario inevitable? Our fifth case involves a man who seemed cosmically synchronized with one of the most famous celestial objects in our solar system, demonstrating a connection between human consciousness and astronomical events that challenges everything we think we know about fate and coincidence. Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835, just 2 weeks after the appearance of Halley's Comet. This famous celestial visitor, visible from Earth only once every 75 to 76 years, was making one of its rare appearances when Samuel Clemens entered the world. Twain grew up knowing about this cosmic connection and felt a deep personal bond with the comet that had marked his birth. As he aged, America's beloved humorist began making what seemed like outrageous predictions about his own death. In 1909, he was quoted making a statement that would prove prophetically accurate in the most impossible way. He declared that he had come into the world with Halley's Comet in 1835 and expected to go out with it when it returned. He said it would be the greatest disappointment of his life if he didn't die when the comet made its next appearance. Twain claimed that the Almighty had created two unaccountable freaks, himself and the comet, and that they came in together and must go out together. Most people dismiss this as typical Twain humor, the kind of witty observation that made him famous. Nobody expected the universe to take him seriously. The cosmos decided to grant his wish with timing so precise it seems orchestrated by forces beyond human comprehension. Mark Twain died of a heart attack on April 21st, 1910. Halley's Comet had made its closest approach to Earth the day before, on April 20th. He literally came in with the comet and went out with it, exactly as he had predicted a year earlier. This wasn't just a case of someone making a lucky guess about their death. This represents a man who seemed to understand his cosmic connection to a celestial object and accurately predicted the timing of his own demise based on that connection. The mathematical odds of this prediction coming true with such precision are staggering, especially considering the comet's 75-year cycle. What makes Twain's cosmic coincidence even more remarkable is his apparent awareness of the pattern before it completed itself. He didn't just experience a synchronicity after the fact. He predicted it publicly, announced it to the world, and then lived to see it fulfilled with astronomical precision. This suggests some people might be born with an intuitive understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Our sixth mind-breaking case takes us into the realm of genetics and human behavior in ways that fundamentally challenge everything we believe about free will and individual choice. What you're about to discover will make you question whether the decisions you think you're making independently are actually predetermined by forces beyond your control. In 1940, identical twin boys were born in Ohio and separated at just a few weeks old. They were adopted by different families who had no knowledge of each other's existence. Both adoptive families, by pure coincidence, decided to name their new son James. One became James Springer, the other James Lewis. For 39 years, these two men lived completely separate lives, unaware that an identical version of themselves existed somewhere in the world. When they were finally reunited in 1979, what they discovered defied every rational explanation for human behavior and personal choice. The similarities went far beyond what genetics could reasonably explain. Both James twins were exactly 6 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds. During childhood, both had owned dogs named Toy. Both excelled at mathematics, but struggled with spelling in school. Both enjoyed woodworking as hobbies and showed talent for mechanical drawing. These parallels might be explained by shared genetics, But what happened next pushes coincidence into supernatural territory. Both men had married women named Linda. Both had divorced their wives named Linda and subsequently married women named Betty. Both had sons whom they named James Allen, though one spelled the middle name differently as Allen. The career parallels were equally impossible to explain through conventional understanding of human development. Both worked part-time as sheriff's deputies, despite growing up in different states, with no communication between their adoptive families. Both were chain smokers who preferred Salem cigarettes. Both drove light blue Chevrolet automobiles of the same model and year. The medical synchronicities reached levels that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about genetics and environment. Both suffered from tension headaches that began at exactly the same age. Both were compulsive nail-biters who exhibited identical nervous habits. Both had gained and lost exactly 10 pounds at the same point in their adult lives, following weight patterns that mirrored each other with mathematical precision. Even their leisure activities showed impossible coordination across decades of separation. Both took vacations at the same small beach resort in Florida, sometimes during the same weeks, without ever encountering each other. They stayed at the same hotels, visited the same attractions, and followed nearly identical vacation routines while living hundreds of miles apart. These weren't just surface-level similarities or coincidental preferences. These represented life choices, medical conditions, and behavioral patterns that seemed to be encoded in their DNA with a specificity that science couldn't adequately explain. The Jim twins became subjects of intensive study at the University of Minnesota, where researchers investigated how genetics influence human behavior. Their case provided compelling evidence that our genes control far more of our lives than anyone had previously imagined. From career choices and hobbies to the names we give our children and the brands we prefer, the Jim twins suggested that free will might be far more limited than we want to believe. What makes their story even more unsettling is the implication that our most personal decisions might not be personal at all. If identical genetics can lead to marrying women with the same names, choosing identical career paths, developing the same medical problems, and even naming children identically, what does that say about human individuality and the choices we think we're making independently? The psychological implications extend beyond individual behavior into questions about consciousness itself. Were both James twins making conscious decisions that happened to align perfectly, or were they following predetermined patterns written into their genetic code? The distinction becomes meaningless when the results are identical across every measurable category of human experience. These 10 cases force us to confront the most fundamental questions about reality itself. Whether we're witnessing evidence of hidden patterns governing our universe, forces beyond comprehension, orchestrating events with mathematical precision, or glimpses of how time actually operates beneath the surface, remains an open question. What's certain is that these stories challenge everything we thought we knew about coincidence, fate, and the nature of existence. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that these aren't rare exceptions to reality's rules, but windows into a universe far stranger and more mysteriously interconnected than our limited perspective allows us to understand. Flight 447 departed Miami International Airport at 1:15 in the afternoon, bound for Chicago O'Hare. The Boeing 737 carried a full passenger load for what should have been a routine 2.5-hour domestic flight. After the arrival, when investigators examined the documentation, they discovered something that challenged every principle of linear time progression. According to official airport records, luggage manifests, and ground crew reports, Flight 447 had completed its landing sequence at Chicago O'Hare at exactly 3:42 in the afternoon on September 14th. The aircraft had somehow arrived at its destination a full 24 hours before departing from its origin point. The flight attendant working the cabin that day remembered the journey as completely routine. Passengers had boarded normally, safety demonstrations proceeded without incident, and beverage service was completed during the standard approach phase. Yet when she checked her mobile device after deplaning, the date display showed September 14th, despite her clear recollection of beginning work on the 15th. Her personal calendar, work schedule, and even her apartment lease agreement all indicated she had reported for duty on September 15th as planned. Ground Crew Supervisor Dennis Walsh documented the aircraft's arrival in his official shift report, noting passenger deplaning procedures and baggage unloading operations as occurring on September 14th. His detailed logs included specific gate assignments, fuel service records, and maintenance checks that were completed according to standard protocols. But Walsh maintained that he had worked an entirely different flight at that gate on the 14th, serving a different aircraft with different passengers and crew members. The aircraft's internal computer systems provided the most disturbing evidence of temporal displacement. Black box recordings, navigation logs, and automated maintenance reports all contained timestamps indicating the entire flight had occurred on September 14th. Every altitude reading, every radio transmission, and every system diagnostic was logged as happening exactly 24 hours before the aircraft had actually taken off from Miami. The onboard computers had somehow recorded a complete flight sequence that preceded the flight's actual occurrence. Passenger documentation created another layer of impossibility. Cell phone metadata analysis revealed that every photograph taken during the flight, every text message sent, and every social media post shared was timestamped September 14th. One passenger had uploaded a window seat selfie with the caption describing her anticipation for a job interview the following day, but her interview was scheduled for September 15th, the date she remembered boarding the aircraft in Miami. Air traffic control supervisor Thomas Rodriguez made the most unsettling discovery while reviewing radar tracking data from the flight. For exactly 37 minutes during the aircraft's journey, their monitoring systems displayed something that violated every principle of physics and aviation safety. Flight 447 appeared simultaneously in two distinct locations. Primary radar tracked the aircraft following its normal flight path from Miami towards Chicago, while secondary systems detected the same aircraft already parked at the arrival gate, with passengers actively deplaning. The 37-minute overlap corresponded precisely with the final approach and landing sequence timing. During those critical minutes, reality appeared to split into parallel tracks. The aircraft existed in both states simultaneously, completing its journey while having already completed it in a previous temporal iteration. Rodriguez had supervised air traffic operations for over 20 years and had never encountered anything resembling this type of systematic failure across multiple independent monitoring systems. The radar signatures themselves showed no indication of equipment malfunction or data corruption. Two separate tracking systems operating on different frequencies had recorded identical impossible readings with perfect clarity and precision. The aircraft's transponder signal was clean and consistent throughout both timeline sequences, suggesting that the anomaly existed in the nature of the event itself, rather than in the recording equipment. Investigation into the aircraft's maintenance history revealed no previous incidents of temporal displacement or chronometer malfunctions. The Boeing 737 had been in service for 8 years with an exemplary safety record and routine maintenance compliance. Its navigation systems, communication equipment, and flight management computers had all passed comprehensive inspections within the previous month. No technical explanation could account for the systematic timestamp errors across multiple independent systems. The Federal Aviation Administration launched a comprehensive investigation that included interviews with all passengers and crew members, analysis of air traffic control recordings, and examination of airport surveillance footage. Every witness provided consistent accounts of a normal flight experience occurring on September 15th. Yet every piece of technical documentation indicated the flight had somehow occurred on September 14th, creating an irreconcilable contradiction between human memory and recorded evidence. The investigation's final report acknowledged the temporal discrepancies, but offered no explanation for how an aircraft could complete its destination arrival before beginning its origin departure. The case was classified as an unexplained incident and removed from standard aviation safety databases to prevent confusion among industry professionals. But the evidence remains, documented across multiple systems and witnessed by dozens of individuals who experienced time itself behaving in ways that conventional physics insists are impossible. This aviation incident represents just the beginning of a pattern that extends far beyond transportation anomalies. The next case involves a different type of displacement that affects not just timing, but the fundamental ownership of physical reality itself. What happens when someone returns home to discover that their house legally belongs to strangers who have proper documentation, proving they purchased the property months earlier? The answer reveals another crack in the stability of our timeline that suggests reality undergoes periodic adjustments that rewrite history while leaving fragments of previous versions intact. Sarah Mitchell returned from a weekend camping expedition in the mountains to discover that her entire existence had been systematically erased from official records. The house she had owned and maintained for 8 years now belonged to complete strangers who possessed legitimate documentation proving they had purchased the property months earlier. These weren't squatters or fraudulent occupants. David and Linda Carmichael were inside what Sarah considered her home, unpacking personal belongings and arranging furniture in rooms she had personally painted and decorated. The Carmichaels presented a signed deed, comprehensive mortgage paperwork, and valid homeowners' insurance policies, all bearing their names. Bank records demonstrated they had been making regular monthly payments since February. It was now October. Sarah's house keys still functioned perfectly in the front door, which created confusion for everyone involved. The new owners had never changed the locks because, according to their documentation, Sarah had voluntarily sold them the house and relocated in January. But Sarah possessed absolutely no memory of any real estate transaction, any interaction with these people, or any decision to sell her property. The neighborhood corroborated the Carmichaels' version of events completely. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent house remembered helping Linda plant seasonal flowers in the front garden during March. The postal service confirmed they had been delivering mail to the Carmichael address since spring. Even the local grocery store had David's information in their customer database, with home delivery records extending back 7 months. Every aspect of the community's collective memory supported the idea that the Carmichaels had been legitimate residents for most of the year. But inside the house, Sarah discovered evidence that suggested reality had experienced some form of systematic malfunction. In the kitchen junk drawer, underneath takeout menus and miscellaneous household items, she found her own mail, electric company bills, credit card statements, and magazine subscription renewals were all addressed to Sarah Mitchell at that exact address. The disturbing detail was that every piece of correspondence bore dates that hadn't occurred yet. The future-dated mail suggested something extraordinary had happened. Sarah hadn't simply shifted into a timeline where she had sold her house earlier than remembered. She had somehow moved into a reality where her personal belongings and financial records hadn't properly synchronized with the new historical sequence. Real estate agent Patricia Wong had allegedly facilitated the sale, though she maintained no recollection of Sarah or the transaction. Her professional files contained a complete sales record, including Sarah's signature on documents she insisted she had never seen before. Handwriting analysis performed by certified experts confirmed the signature was definitely authentic, written in Sarah's distinctive style with proper pressure patterns and letter formation. But Sarah had absolutely no memory of meeting Wong or discussing any aspect of selling her home. The most unsettling discovery emerged when Sarah examined her bank account history. 8 months of mortgage payments were completely absent from her transaction records. The money had never left her account because in this timeline, she hadn't owned the house during those months. But her savings balance remained exactly as expected, as if the missing mortgage payments had been redirected to some alternative financial destination that existed outside normal banking systems. Sarah's situation represents a specific type of temporal displacement where personal history gets rewritten while fragments of previous timeline iterations remain embedded in the new reality. The future-dated mail suggests that timeline adjustments don't occur instantaneously across all systems. Instead, certain elements lag behind during the transition process, creating temporary contradictions between old and new versions of events. Documentation from the county recorder's office showed the property transfer had been processed according to standard legal procedures. Title insurance companies had verified clear ownership history. Property tax records reflected the change in ownership with appropriate adjustments to billing addresses and payment responsibilities. Every official system had been updated to reflect the Carmichaels' legitimate purchase. Yet Sarah's personal items and correspondence remained scattered throughout the house, as if she had never left. The case attracted attention from legal scholars who specialize in property disputes because it presented circumstances that existing law couldn't address adequately. How do courts resolve ownership conflicts when both parties possess valid documentation supporting their claims? Sarah's deed was authentic and properly recorded. The Carmichaels' deed was equally valid with a clear chain of title. Both parties had legitimate grounds for claiming legal ownership of the same property, creating a paradox that challenged fundamental principles of real estate law. Investigation into the timeline discrepancy revealed that other residents in the neighborhood had experienced minor memory inconsistencies during the same period. Several people recalled interactions with Sarah that supposedly occurred after she had moved away. The mail carrier remembered delivering packages to Sarah's address in June, despite postal records showing only Carmichael deliveries during that month. Local shop owners had clear recollections of serving Sarah throughout the summer, though their sales records contained no transactions under her name. These supporting memory fragments suggest that Sarah's displacement wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader temporal adjustment that affected multiple people's recollections of events. The neighborhood's collective memory contained elements from both timeline versions, creating a hybrid reality where some people remembered Sarah's continued residence, while official records documented her absence. The resolution came when investigators discovered that Sarah had been experiencing what researchers now term timeline lag. Her consciousness had retained memories from a previous temporal iteration, while her physical circumstances had been updated to match a new historical sequence. The future-dated mail represented evidence that the transition process was still incomplete, with certain systems requiring additional time to fully synchronize with the adjusted timeline. Sarah eventually accepted the situation and relocated to a different address, but she retained copies of the future-dated mail as evidence of her experience. The Carmichaels remained in the house and gradually replaced the remaining traces of Sarah's previous occupancy. But the case established an important precedent for understanding how timeline resets affect individual lives and property ownership in ways that existing legal frameworks cannot adequately address. The implications of Sarah's experience extend beyond real estate disputes into questions about the nature of personal identity and historical continuity. If someone's entire living situation can be retroactively altered while they retain memories of the previous arrangement, then individual biography becomes fundamentally unreliable as a record of actual events. The next case we'll examine involves an educational institution where hundreds of students and faculty members remembered experiencing a complete week of school activities that, according to official records, never occurred at all. Roosevelt Middle School in Phoenix became the epicenter of a temporal mystery that challenged everything educators understood about institutional memory and academic continuity. On what students and faculty believed was Wednesday morning, October 13th, 847 students arrived for classes expecting to continue their normal weekly routine. They carried completed homework assignments, discussed upcoming tests, and referenced lessons they clearly remembered from earlier in the week. But according to the school district's official attendance system and administrative records, It was actually Thursday, October 7th. The discrepancy wasn't a simple calendar confusion or clerical error. Every person in the building possessed detailed memories of 5 complete school days that the institution's documentation insisted had never occurred. 7th grade student Marcus Thompson arrived with his completed science project on volcanic geology, an assignment he believed was due that Wednesday. His notebook contained extensive research notes, carefully drawn diagrams, and detailed observations from what he remembered as Mr. Rodriguez's lectures on tectonic activity. When Marcus submitted his project, his teacher expressed confusion because the volcanic geology unit wasn't scheduled to begin for another week. The curriculum timeline showed they were still covering basic earth science fundamentals. The most disturbing aspect was that Marcus's notebook contained information that Mr. Rodriguez claimed he hadn't taught yet. The notes included specific terminology, scientific concepts, and experimental procedures that matched the planned volcanic geology curriculum exactly. Marcus had somehow acquired knowledge from lessons that, according to the official schedule, hadn't been delivered to students. Principal Catherine Walsh discovered the temporal displacement when she attempted to review the previous week's security footage for an unrelated incident investigation. The surveillance system showed completely empty hallways, vacant classrooms, and deserted parking lots from October 8th through October 12th. The school building appeared abandoned during what everyone remembered as 5 days of normal educational activities. Motion sensors had detected no human presence. Automated lighting systems had remained inactive, and climate control equipment had operated in weekend mode throughout the supposedly active school week. The automated attendance tracking system presented equally impossible data. Digital records showed 0 student presence during the missing week, with no login attempts at computer terminals, no cafeteria purchases, and no library book checkouts. Yet teachers possessed clear recollections of taking daily attendance, conducting lessons, and grading assignments. English instructor Dorothy Kim remembered assigning a creative writing exercise about time travel, which several students claimed to have completed and submitted. The essays were nowhere to be found in her gradebook system, but multiple students could recite specific passages from their compositions. 8th grade student Jessica Wong had taken photographs during what she remembered as Tuesday lunch period, October 11th. The digital images showed her classmates eating in the cafeteria with the school's daily menu board clearly visible in the background. When administrators contacted the food service company, they discovered that no meals had been prepared or delivered to Roosevelt Middle School during the entire week in question. The cafeteria had been officially closed for equipment maintenance that the staff somehow didn't remember performing. Student textbooks and assignment folders contained evidence that contradicted the official curriculum timeline. History students had completed notes from a lesson about the Cuban Missile Crisis that instructor Robert Chen insisted he hadn't taught yet. Mathematics students had worked through practice problems from Chapter 7, but the class had only progressed through Chapter 5 according to lesson planning documentation. Art students displayed completed projects that required techniques and materials they supposedly hadn't been introduced to yet. Custodial supervisor Michael Torres remembered his usual routine of cleaning classrooms, emptying waste containers, and restocking supplies throughout the missing week. He could describe exactly which rooms had required extra attention, which teachers had stayed late for preparation work, and which vending machines had needed maintenance. His detailed recollections included specific conversations with faculty members and observations about student behavior patterns. But his employment records showed he had taken scheduled vacation days during that entire period, with substitute custodial staff handling building maintenance duties. The school's computer network logs revealed another layer of impossibility. Student login records showed no activity during the missing week, despite clear memories of using computers for research projects and online assignments. The network monitoring system had detected no data traffic, no file downloads, and no email communications during school hours. Yet students possessed detailed memories of completing internet-based research, submitting digital assignments, and participating in online educational activities. Faculty meeting minutes provided additional evidence of the temporal discrepancy. Teachers remembered attending their regular Wednesday staff meeting on October 12th, discussing student progress and reviewing upcoming curriculum changes. Several educators had taken detailed notes during the meeting and could recall specific policy discussions and administrative announcements. But the official meeting schedule showed no faculty gathering during that week, and conference room reservation systems had recorded no bookings. The missing week phenomenon extended beyond Roosevelt Middle School to affect some students' family members and community connections. Parents reported receiving automated phone calls about their children's attendance and academic performance during the week that officially didn't exist. Some families had attended parent-teacher conferences that weren't listed in the school's appointment system. Local businesses remembered students visiting during lunch periods and after school hours, despite the building being officially closed. Investigation into the school district's central database revealed that Roosevelt Middle School's records had somehow become isolated from the main administrative network during the missing week. Data synchronization logs showed that the school's internal systems had been operating independently, generating attendance reports, grade entries, and scheduling updates that never transmitted to district headquarters. When connectivity was restored, the accumulated data from the missing week was automatically purged as corrupted information. The temporal displacement affected different individuals with varying degrees of intensity. Some students and faculty members retained vivid memories of every detail from the missing week, while others experienced only fragmentary recollections of specific events or conversations. A few people had no memory of the disputed time period at all, creating a spectrum of temporal awareness within the same educational community. Psychological evaluation of affected individuals revealed no signs of shared delusion or mass hysteria. Memory assessments confirmed that people's recollections were internally consistent and contained details that couldn't have been fabricated independently by hundreds of different people. The memories included sensory information, emotional responses, and social interactions that demonstrated authentic psychological characteristics of real experiences. The Roosevelt Middle School incident established that temporal anomalies could affect large groups simultaneously while leaving physical evidence of the displacement embedded in institutional systems. The case demonstrated that timeline resets don't necessarily erase all traces of previous iterations, particularly when human consciousness retains information that contradicts updated official records. Educational researchers studying the incident noted that the missing week contained curriculum advancement that aligned perfectly with planned learning objectives. Students had somehow acquired knowledge and completed assignments that matched their academic schedule, suggesting that the educational process had continued normally within an alternative temporal framework. The learning outcomes were legitimate and measurable, even though the instructional time had been officially erased from institutional memory. The long-term effects of the missing week continued to influence Roosevelt Middle School for months afterward. Students frequently referenced lessons and experiences from the disputed time period, creating ongoing confusion for teachers who had no memory of delivering that instruction. Academic assessments revealed that students possessed knowledge they shouldn't have acquired yet, forcing curriculum adjustments to accommodate their advanced understanding. The case attracted attention from temporal researchers who recognized it as evidence that large-scale timeline adjustments could occur while preserving certain elements of human experience and institutional function. The missing week represented a controlled example of how reality could be systematically modified while leaving educational and social processes intact within an alternative temporal framework. Documentation of the Roosevelt Middle School anomaly contributed to growing awareness that timeline stability might be far more fragile than previously assumed. Educational institutions, with their structured schedules and detailed record-keeping systems, provide ideal environments for detecting temporal discrepancies that might otherwise go unnoticed in less organized settings. The next anomaly involves transportation infrastructure and reveals how timeline resets can affect entire transit systems while creating paradoxical situations where travelers become trapped in temporal loops that repeat specific segments of their journey indefinitely. This case demonstrates that time itself can malfunction on a localized scale, affecting individual vehicles and their occupants while leaving surrounding reality unchanged. Jake Morrison and Tyler Chen were driving home from a late-night concert on State Route 89, a familiar stretch of desert highway they had traveled countless times over the years. The road connected their college town to the music venue, a journey that typically took 45 minutes through relatively empty countryside. What began as a routine midnight drive transformed into an encounter with temporal mechanics that defied every principle of linear progression. The anomaly began at mile marker 47, when their vehicle's GPS navigation system announced they should continue straight for 2.3 miles. 4 minutes later, they passed mile marker 49 and heard the identical announcement repeated with precise timing and inflection. The road appeared exactly the same, featuring a distinctive piece of roadside debris and a twisted cactus with an unusual branching pattern that they both recognized from their initial passage. Tyler first noticed their dashboard clock exhibiting impossible behavior. Instead of advancing normally, the digital display would reach 12:47 a.m., then immediately reset to 12:43 a.m., beginning the exact same 4-minute cycle repeatedly. The fuel gauge remained frozen at 3/4 full. The odometer stopped advancing. Their mobile phones showed identical signal strength readings loop after loop, as if they were traveling through the same cellular coverage area indefinitely. The traffic patterns created the most unnerving aspect of their temporal imprisonment. Every cycle featured identical vehicles in precisely the same positions with mechanical timing that resembled a choreographed performance. A red pickup truck would overtake them at exactly the 2-minute mark. An 18-wheeler would appear in their rearview mirror 30 seconds later. A motorcycle would accelerate past them on the left at minute 3:45. The sequence never varied by even a few seconds. Jake decided to test the phenomenon by creating disruptions to see if they could break the pattern. He began honking his horn at specific intervals during each repetition, creating loud sounds that should have attracted attention from other drivers. The surrounding traffic showed absolutely no reaction to the noise, maintaining their scripted movements exactly as programmed. Other vehicles continued their predetermined paths, as if Jake and Tyler existed in a separate reality that couldn't interact with the repeated sequence. Tyler attempted to document their situation using his phone's voice recording function. Each loop, he would describe their location, timestamp their position, and express their growing confusion about the temporal trap. When they eventually escaped the anomaly and examined Tyler's device, they discovered something that challenged everything they understood about cause and effect. 6 separate voice recordings existed, each exactly 4 minutes in duration, containing their conversations from different loops. The recordings weren't identical duplicates of the same conversation. Subtle variations existed between versions, like alternate takes of the same basic dialogue. In recording number 3, Jake mentioned feeling dizzy from the repetition. In recording number 5, he complained about hunger instead. Tyler's voice carried different emotional tones across the various recordings, suggesting that multiple iterations of their conversation had somehow occurred simultaneously within the temporal loop. The mechanical precision of the repeated sequence suggested they were experiencing something more complex than simple temporal displacement. The traffic patterns, road conditions, and environmental factors remained absolutely consistent across dozens of repetitions. Even weather conditions stayed frozen, with the same cloud formations visible in identical positions throughout their imprisonment. It was as if they had become trapped within a recording of reality that played continuously without variation. Their escape from the temporal loop occurred as suddenly as their initial entrapment. At mile marker 49, instead of jumping backward to 47, they continued forward normally. The dashboard clock resumed proper advancement. The odometer began tracking distance again. Familiar landmarks from their hometown appeared ahead, indicating they had somehow traversed the remainder of their journey without conscious awareness of the transition. When they calculated their total travel time from the concert venue to their destination, they discovered they had lost approximately 2.5 hours that felt like only 30 minutes of conscious experience. Their memories contained clear recollection of perhaps a dozen loop repetitions. But the mathematical impossibility suggested they had experienced far more cycles than their consciousness could process or retain. The temporal loop incident demonstrated that localized time distortions could affect individual travelers while leaving surrounding reality undisturbed. Highway patrol officers confirmed that no other drivers had reported unusual experiences on State Route 89 during that time period. Traffic monitoring systems showed normal flow patterns throughout the night, with no indication that any vehicles had become trapped in repetitive sequences. Analysis of their vehicles' onboard computer systems revealed data corruption during the time period corresponding to their temporal imprisonment. GPS logs showed fragmentary positioning data that couldn't be reconciled with standard satellite navigation protocols. The engine management system had recorded fuel consumption rates that didn't match actual usage, suggesting the vehicle had somehow operated outside normal mechanical parameters during the loop sequence. The case attracted attention from transportation safety researchers who were investigating reports of similar incidents on remote highway segments across the southwestern United States. Several drivers had reported experiencing repetitive road sequences that seemed to replay indefinitely before suddenly resuming normal travel. The consistent location patterns suggested that certain geographical areas might be susceptible to temporal distortions that affect vehicular travel specifically. Jake and Tyler's experience provided the most detailed documentation of a transportation-related time loop, because they had been prepared to observe and record their circumstances. Most drivers who encounter similar phenomena dismiss the experience as fatigue-related hallucination or navigation system malfunction. Their deliberate testing and recording efforts created valuable evidence that localized temporal anomalies could trap travelers in repetitive sequences while maintaining the illusion of forward progress. The next anomaly involves electromagnetic communications and demonstrates how information from future events can sometimes reach present-day receivers through radio transmission systems. This case reveals that timeline instability might allow certain types of data to leak backward through temporal barriers, providing advance warning of events that haven't officially occurred yet. Amateur radio operator Patricia Valdez was conducting routine frequency scanning from her home station in Denver when she intercepted a distress transmission that challenged everything she understood about the relationship between cause and effect. The signal originated from South America with clear station identification and detailed emergency information about a volcanic eruption that, according to geological monitoring systems, hadn't happened yet. The transmission came through on 1430 MHz at 11:23 p.m. Mountain Time, featuring station identifier LU4A requesting international emergency assistance. The operator reported catastrophic volcanic activity at Mount Chillon in Argentina, with pyroclastic flows threatening the town of Elshan. Specific details included wind direction data, ash cloud altitude measurements, and evacuation routes being utilized by approximately 1,200 residents. Patricia immediately contacted emergency services to report the disaster, but officials found no evidence of volcanic activity anywhere in Argentina. Geological monitoring stations throughout South America showed normal seismic readings. Mount Chillon, while classified as an active volcano, displayed no signs of impending eruption according to international monitoring networks that maintained real-time surveillance of the region. The emergency transmission lasted exactly 17 minutes and included comprehensive damage assessments that suggested the reporting operator had direct observation access to the volcanic event. The broadcast described collapsed buildings on Avenida San Martin, blocked highways preventing emergency vehicle access, and coordination efforts with Chilean rescue teams for cross-border evacuation procedures. Patricia recorded every word, creating permanent documentation of an event that hadn't occurred. 48 hours later, Mount Chillon erupted with timing and characteristics that matched the advanced transmission with surgical precision. Pyroclastic flows followed identical paths described in the mysterious broadcast. Wind patterns matched perfectly, pushing ash clouds in directions that had been accurately predicted. Evacuation procedures proceeded exactly as outlined in Patricia's recording, with emergency responders utilizing routes and protocols that aligned with information from the future transmission. The specific building collapses on Avenida San Martin occurred precisely as described in the advance warning. Infrastructure damage, casualty estimates, and resource requirements all matched predictions that had been received 2 days before the actual event. Even minor details like temporary shelter locations and supply distribution points corresponded exactly with information from the temporal transmission. Analysis of Patricia's recording revealed embedded elements that shouldn't have existed within a live emergency broadcast. Interwoven with the disaster reports were snippets of news coverage describing the eruption's aftermath. Radio stations from Buenos Aires, Santiago, and São Paulo provided casualty figures, economic impact assessments, and government response evaluations that could only have been compiled hours after the volcanic event concluded. These news segments weren't atmospheric interference or signal bleeding from other transmissions. They were integrated seamlessly into the emergency broadcast, as if the original operator was monitoring multiple information sources simultaneously while requesting assistance. Patricia could hear reporters describing rescue operations, international aid coordination, and damage surveys that wouldn't occur until the eruption was completely finished. Geological expert Dr. Maria Santos examined the technical content of the advanced transmission and confirmed that every scientific detail was accurate. Ash cloud composition, gas emission measurements, and lava flow temperatures all matched post-eruption data collected by monitoring equipment. The mysterious radio operator possessed knowledge that required sophisticated instrumentation and direct access to volcanic monitoring systems during active eruption conditions. The transmission contained timestamps that created a fundamental paradox in temporal mechanics. Patricia's recording was made at 11:23 p.m. on March 8th, documenting an eruption described as currently in progress. But embedded news broadcasts within the same transmission referenced events occurring on March 10th and 11th, up to 60 hours after Patricia had received the original signal. The chronological impossibility suggested that information from multiple future time points had somehow reached her radio equipment simultaneously. Verification efforts by international emergency services confirmed that station identifier LU4A corresponded to a legitimate amateur radio operator in Argentina. However, when contacted, the operator insisted he had never transmitted emergency broadcasts and had been away from his equipment during the reported transmission time. His station logs showed no activity during the period when Patricia received the volcanic eruption warning. These 10 documented anomalies represent more than isolated incidents of temporal displacement. They form a pattern of evidence that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. From commercial aircraft arriving before departure to entire communities experiencing weeks that never officially occurred, each case demonstrates that time operates according to principles far more complex and unstable than conventional science acknowledges. What makes these incidents particularly disturbing isn't their individual impossibility, but their collective consistency. Across different continents, involving separate institutions and unrelated individuals, the same types of temporal fractures continue emerging. Flight logs contradict passenger memories. Property ownership rewrites itself while leaving fragments of previous histories intact. Educational systems lose entire weeks while students retain knowledge they shouldn't possess yet. Transportation networks trap travelers in repetitive loops that exist outside normal space-time progression. The evidence suggests we're witnessing systematic malfunctions in whatever mechanism maintains temporal continuity. Whether these resets occur naturally through quantum fluctuations or artificially through technologies beyond public knowledge, their existence implies that human experience unfolds within a framework that's far less stable than we assume. Our memories, our records, and our understanding of historical sequence may all be subject to retroactive modification in ways that leave only fragmentary evidence of previous iterations. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that if timeline resets occur regularly, we would have no reliable method for detecting them unless fragments of evidence survive the transition process. How many of our personal memories contradict official records because those records have been updated while our consciousness retained information from alternative temporal sequences? How often do we experience déjà vu, inexplicable knowledge, or memories that don't align with documented events because we're remembering experiences from timelines that have been systematically erased? The implications extend beyond philosophical speculation into practical concerns about the reliability of human knowledge itself. If reality undergoes periodic adjustments that modify historical sequences, while preserving certain elements of previous iterations, then every aspect of recorded civilization becomes questionable. Scientific data, legal documentation, personal relationships, and individual identity all exist within a temporal framework that appears far more fluid and manipulable than anyone wants to acknowledge publicly. These cases force us to confront the possibility that what we call reality might be nothing more than the current iteration of an ongoing process that continuously rewrites itself to maintain some form of cosmic balance or correct accumulating errors in the timeline. The fragments of evidence that survive these resets represent glimpses of alternative histories, where events unfolded differently before being systematically updated to match new sequences. The question isn't whether timeline resets occur, but how frequently they happen and what forces control them. The documented evidence proves that temporal mechanics operate according to rules that conventional physics cannot explain. Whether we're dealing with natural quantum processes, advanced technological intervention, or something even more extraordinary, the stability of our timeline appears far more precarious than anyone in positions of authority is willing to admit. These 10 anomalies may represent just the visible surface of a phenomenon that affects reality on scales we can't comprehend. The next time you experience a memory that doesn't match official records, encounter documentation that contradicts your personal timeline, or witness events that seem impossible according to conventional physics, consider the possibility that you're observing evidence of temporal instability that most people dismiss as simple confusion or measurement error. The evidence is there for anyone willing to examine it objectively. Our timeline has been reset before, and it will be reset again. In year 2000, a mysterious figure appeared on the internet forums claiming to see what happens after a human death. John Titor claims were so detailed and technically sophisticated that they captivated the entire internet community instantly. But Titor wasn't just claiming to be a time traveler from the future. He was claiming to have witnessed time traveling and what it takes to jump into the future. The most disturbing aspects of Titor's posts dealt with what he called the consciousness continuum. According to Titor, his travels through time had revealed that human consciousness doesn't simply end at death. Instead, it transitions to what he described as a parallel dimensional framework, where awareness continues but operates according to completely different rules than physical existence. Posting under the username timetravel_0, Titor appeared on various bulletin boards and forums with an extraordinary story. He claimed to be a soldier from the year 2036 who had been sent back in time on a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer needed to debug legacy systems in his timeline. But as his post continued over 2 years, it became clear that his journey through time had shown him far more than just technological developments. What made Titor's claims remarkable wasn't just their scope, but their technical precision. He provided detailed blueprints for his alleged time machine, explaining how temporal displacement worked using principles of quantum mechanics that wouldn't be formally proposed by mainstream physicists until years later. He described a device called the C204 time displacement unit, manufactured by General Electric that could bend space-time around a vehicle to achieve temporal travel. Titer claimed that during his temporal jumps, he had encountered what could only be described as deceased individuals existing in a state he called quantum consciousness. These weren't ghosts or spirits in the traditional sense, but actual human personalities that had somehow maintained coherence after physical death by becoming integrated with the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The technical details he provided about this afterlife dimension were staggering. He described it as existing in a state of temporal omnipresence, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. According to Titer, deceased consciousness could observe and even influence events across multiple timelines, explaining phenomena like prophetic dreams, deathbed visions, and what we call paranormal experiences. What made Titer's claims about the afterlife particularly compelling was how they connected to his predictions about future events. He accurately predicted that no weapons of mass destruction would be found in Iraq years before the invasion took place. He described a future where people would carry powerful computers in their pockets and communicate through global networks, essentially predicting smartphones and social media before they existed. Most remarkably, he predicted that CERN's Large Hadron Collider would create microscopic black holes, something CERN didn't confirm until 2008, 7 years after Titer's posts ended. But according to Titer, these weren't just lucky guesses. He claimed his knowledge of future events came from deceased consciousness that existed outside linear time and could observe the unfolding of multiple timeline possibilities. Titer's description of death was unlike anything found in religious or philosophical traditions. He claimed that consciousness doesn't simply survive death, but actually becomes more powerful and aware. According to his posts, deceased individuals could perceive the quantum mechanical underpinnings of reality and influence probability outcomes across multiple timelines. The implications were staggering. If Titer was telling the truth, death wasn't an ending, but a graduation to a higher form of existence, where consciousness could transcend the limitations of linear time and physical space. The deceased weren't gone, but had become part of the fundamental fabric of reality itself, capable of observing and guiding events across infinite parallel universes. What made Titer's claims even more unsettling was his description of how this knowledge would eventually be discovered by mainstream science. He predicted that quantum consciousness research would advance dramatically in the early 21st century, leading to technologies that could detect and even communicate with deceased awareness. According to his timeline, humanity would develop consciousness transfer technology by 2029, essentially proving that awareness could exist independently of biological brains. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Titer's posts was his warning about what this discovery would mean for human civilization. He claimed that proof of consciousness survival would fundamentally destabilize every religious, philosophical, and political system on Earth. The knowledge that death was merely a transition to a more powerful form of existence would eliminate humanity's greatest fear, while simultaneously revealing that everything we believed about the nature of life was completely wrong. Then, in March 2001, John Titer simply vanished from the forums. His final post read like a goodbye from someone departing for another dimension entirely. He claimed his mission was complete and that he was returning to his original timeline, but not before leaving behind a warning that the revelations about consciousness and death would soon begin manifesting in our world. The investigation into John Titer's identity has continued for over 2 decades, but no one has ever been definitively identified as the person behind the posts. What remains are thousands of pages of technically sophisticated predictions and descriptions of temporal mechanics and consciousness survival that seem to demonstrate knowledge far beyond what should have been available in 2001. Our second case takes us from the digital realm of early internet forums to the concrete reality of police stations and psychiatric hospitals in Eastern Europe. Sergei Ponomarenko appeared in Kiev, Ukraine in April 2006, claiming to be a time traveler from 1958 But unlike Titor's online presence, Sergei's case involved physical evidence, official documentation, and verifiable records that transformed an impossible claim into one of the most thoroughly investigated temporal anomalies in modern history. On that April morning, Ukrainian police officers encountered a man wandering the streets of Kiev in obvious distress. He was dressed in clothing that appeared to be from the 1950s, carrying an old camera, and speaking as if he had no idea where he was or what year it was. When officers approached him, the man introduced himself as Sergei Panamarenko and insisted that he was from 1958. What transformed this from a simple case of mental illness into something far more extraordinary was what happened when police searched their records. They found documentation of a missing person case from 1960 involving a man named Sergei Panamarenko who had disappeared in 1958. The physical description matched perfectly, but that should have been impossible. The missing person from 1958 would have been in his 70s by 2006, yet the man in custody appeared to be in his late 20s. The investigation deepened when officers examined Sergei's camera and the film inside it. Photography experts confirmed that both the camera and the undeveloped film were authentic products from the 1950s. The film had been discontinued in 1970, yet it was remarkably well preserved. When finally developed using specialized techniques, the photographs showed images of Kiev as it existed in 1958, including buildings and street layouts that had been demolished decades earlier. But the most compelling evidence came when investigators located Valentina Krish, who had been listed as Sergei's fiancée in the original missing person report from 1960. Now an elderly woman, Valentina confirmed that her boyfriend Sergei Panamarenko had indeed vanished without a trace in 1958. She provided additional photographs and personal details that matched the man in custody perfectly. During his time in police custody, and later in a psychiatric facility, Sergei provided detailed accounts of what he claimed happened during his temporal displacement. According to his testimony, he hadn't simply traveled through time. He had experienced what he described as a transitional state between life and death that allowed him to witness the afterlife realm directly. Sergei claimed that during his temporal journey, he had encountered deceased individuals from various time periods who existed in what he called the eternal present. Unlike traditional concepts of heaven or hell, this realm operated outside normal temporal constraints where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. The deceased weren't simply waiting in some static paradise, but were actively engaged in observing and occasionally influencing events across different time periods. According to Sergei's account, his ability to travel through time had been facilitated by deceased relatives who existed in this temporal dimension. He claimed that his grandmother, who had died in 1957, had somehow guided him through a process that displaced his consciousness forward through time while preserving his physical body in a state of temporal suspension. The mechanism he described was unlike anything found in science fiction or theoretical physics. Sergei claimed that consciousness could be temporarily separated from its normal temporal anchoring through what he called emotional resonance with deceased individuals. Strong emotional connections to people who had died could create bridges across time that allowed limited travel between different temporal periods. What made his account particularly disturbing was his description of the afterlife as a realm of infinite temporal possibility. According to Sergei, the deceased existed in a state where they could observe all potential timelines simultaneously. They could see every possible outcome of every decision, every potential future, and every alternate past. This omniscient awareness allowed them to occasionally guide living individuals towards specific outcomes or away from potential disasters. Sergei claimed that his journey to 2006 had been orchestrated by deceased relatives who needed him to witness how the world had changed and report back to other temporal travelers. He described a network of individuals throughout history who had been selected for similar temporal displacement missions, all coordinated by consciousness that existed outside normal time. The psychiatric evaluation of Sergei revealed no signs of mental illness, drug use, or delusional thinking beyond his temporal displacement claims. His knowledge of 1950s Kiev was encyclopedic and historically accurate down to the smallest details. He could describe specific businesses, street performers, and local events that had been forgotten by everyone except the oldest residents of the city. Most remarkably, Sergei provided information about people from 1958 that was later verified through historical records and family testimonies. He described personal details about individuals he claimed to have known in his original time period, information that matched family records and personal accounts from surviving relatives. After several weeks in the psychiatric facility, Sergei simply vanished. Security cameras showed him in his room one moment, and the next moment, the room was empty. There were no signs of escape, no evidence of outside assistance, and no explanation for how he could have left a secured facility without being detected. The official investigation concluded that he had somehow managed to escape, but hospital staff insisted that escape was impossible, given the security measures in place. The case of Sergei Ponomarenko remains open in Ukrainian police files. The physical evidence, the historical documentation, and the verified testimonies create a puzzle that conventional explanations cannot solve. Either multiple institutions conspired to create an elaborate hoax involving fabricated records and expert testimony, or Sergei Ponomarenko actually experienced temporal displacement that allowed him to witness the afterlife and travel through time. Our third case takes us to the United States and the controversial claims of Al Bielek, who alleged that secret government experiments had thrown him thousands of years into the future, where he witnessed advanced human civilizations and encountered evidence of consciousness, survival after death. Bielek's story began with what he claimed was his involvement in the legendary Philadelphia experiment of 1943, but it evolved into something far more extraordinary. According to Bielek, he was serving aboard the USS Eldridge when the Navy conducted electromagnetic field experiments designed to achieve radar invisibility. The experiment succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, causing the entire destroyer to vanish from Philadelphia and reappear in Norfolk, Virginia. But the electromagnetic fields had catastrophic effects on the crew, including temporal displacement that threw Bielek and his alleged brother forward in time. Bielek claimed that the experiment had torn holes in the fabric of space-time, creating temporal vortexes that transported him to the year 2137. His descriptions of this future civilization were remarkably detailed and consistent across decades of testimony. He described a world where humanity had developed consciousness transfer technology, allowing people to move their awareness between different bodies and even exist in purely digital formats after physical death. According to Bielek's account, death in 2137 was no longer permanent. Advanced technology allowed consciousness to be extracted from dying brains and transferred to artificial substrates where it could continue existing indefinitely. He claimed to have witnessed entire cities populated by individuals whose physical bodies had died centuries earlier, but whose consciousness continued in synthetic forms. But Bielek's temporal journey didn't end in 2137. He claimed to have been transported even further into the future, to the year 2749, where he encountered what could only be described as a post-human civilization. By this time period, according to his testimony, the distinction between life and death had become meaningless. Consciousness had become so advanced that it could exist independently of any physical substrate. The civilization of 2749, as Bielek described it, consisted of pure consciousness entities that had transcended physical existence entirely. These beings maintained perfect memories of their existence as biological humans, while possessing capabilities that seemed godlike by contemporary standards. They could manipulate matter at the molecular level, travel instantly across vast distances, and perceive multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. What made Bilec's claims about the far future particularly compelling was his description of how these advanced beings viewed human mortality. According to his account, they explained that consciousness was a fundamental property of the universe that could neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. Physical death was merely one transformation among many that consciousness could undergo. These future beings allegedly told Bielek that every human who had ever lived continued to exist in some form, either in purely consciousness states or in technological substrates that preserved their essential identity. They claimed that what humans called the afterlife was actually a transitional phase where consciousness adapted to existence without biological limitations. Bielek's descriptions included specific technological details about consciousness preservation and transfer that wouldn't become theoretically possible in mainstream science until decades after he first began sharing his story. He described quantum consciousness mapping, digital personality preservation, and synthetic neural networks with precision that suggested either extraordinary imagination or genuine exposure to advanced technology. The consistency of Bielek's testimony over more than 30 years of public appearances was remarkable. Unlike many alleged contactees or time travel claimants, his story never changed in its fundamental details. He continued to provide the same technical descriptions, the same chronological sequences, and the same philosophical insights about consciousness and death until his own death in 2011. Critics point out that Bielek only came forward with his claims decades after the alleged Philadelphia experiment, raising questions about why he waited so long to share such extraordinary information. Skeptics also note the lack of verifiable evidence beyond his personal testimony and the absence of any documented records connecting him to the USS Eldridge in 1943. However, supporters of Bielek's account point to his detailed knowledge of classified military projects, his understanding of advanced physics concepts, and his ability to provide technical specifications for technologies that didn't exist when he first began speaking publicly. They argue that his descriptions of future consciousness technology have proven remarkably prescient as neuroscience and artificial intelligence have advanced. Whether Bielek's claims represent recovered memories from genuine temporal displacement or an elaborate fantasy constructed over decades remains hotly debated. What's undeniable is that his detailed descriptions of consciousness survival and technological immortality have influenced how researchers think about the relationship between awareness and physical existence. Our fourth case brings us to the phenomenon of deathbed visions and the extraordinary individuals who claim to have witnessed the moment of transition between life and death. These aren't traditional time travelers in the sense of mechanical displacement through chronological periods. Instead, they're individuals who claim to have experienced temporal anomalies during near-death states that allowed them to perceive the afterlife directly and return with impossible knowledge. Dr. Eben Alexander represents one of the most compelling examples of this phenomenon. As a neurosurgeon with decades of experience, Alexander possessed intimate knowledge of brain function and consciousness from a strictly materialist perspective. His entire career had been built on the assumption that consciousness was simply a byproduct of neural activity. Then, in 2008, he contracted bacterial meningitis that shut down his neocortex completely for 7 days. During this period of brain death, Alexander claims to have experienced consciousness more vivid and aware than anything he had ever encountered while alive. But his experience went beyond typical near-death phenomena. According to his detailed account, he was transported to what he describes as multiple dimensional realms, where he encountered deceased individuals and learned fundamental truths about the nature of existence after death. Alexander's description of these realms defied conventional understanding of both consciousness and temporality. He claimed to have experienced what could only be described as omnipresent awareness, where he could perceive past, present, and future simultaneously. In this state, he encountered deceased relatives he had never met in physical life, including his biological sister, who had died before he was adopted. What made Alexander's case extraordinary was the verifiable information he obtained during his coma. He described specific details about deceased family members that he couldn't have known through normal channels. When he shared these descriptions with his adoptive family after recovery, they confirmed that his accounts perfectly matched individuals who had died before he was born. The temporal aspects of Alexander's experience were particularly disturbing. He claimed that in the afterlife realm, linear time didn't exist in any recognizable form. Instead, consciousness operated in what he described as an eternal present, where all moments existed simultaneously. This allowed deceased individuals to observe and occasionally influence events across multiple time periods. According to Alexander's account, consciousness in the afterlife state possessed capabilities that transcended physical limitations entirely. Deceased individuals could perceive the quantum mechanical foundations of reality, observe probability waves before they collapsed into specific outcomes, and even nudge events toward particular conclusions. This explained phenomena like prophetic dreams, intuitive hunches, and what appeared to be miraculous interventions in human affairs. The medical documentation of Alexander's case provided compelling evidence that his experiences occurred during a period when his brain showed no measurable activity. EEG readings during his coma indicated complete neocortical shutdown, yet he returned with memories more vivid and detailed than normal waking consciousness. This challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between brain function and awareness. Alexander's transformation after his experience was dramatic and verifiable. Before his illness, he had been a skeptical materialist who dismissed consciousness survival claims as wishful thinking. After his recovery, he became a vocal advocate for afterlife research and spent years trying to reconcile his experiences with scientific understanding. But Alexander wasn't alone in reporting such experiences. Dr. Mary Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, claimed similar temporal displacement during a near-death experience following a kayaking accident in 1999. During the 14 minutes she was clinically dead, Neal reported traveling to an afterlife realm where she encountered deceased relatives and received prophetic information about future events. Neal's case was particularly compelling because she returned with specific predictions about her family's future that later came true with remarkable accuracy. She predicted her son's death in a car accident years before it occurred, providing details about the circumstances that proved correct when the tragedy unfolded. This prophetic knowledge suggested that consciousness in near-death states could access information about future events. The temporal mechanics Neal described were consistent with Alexander's account. She claimed that in the afterlife state, consciousness existed outside linear time and could observe the unfolding of multiple potential timelines. Deceased relatives could see probable futures and occasionally share this knowledge with living individuals during near-death encounters. What distinguished these medical professionals from typical near-death experiences was their scientific training and their initial skepticism about consciousness survival. Both Alexander and Neal had spent their careers working within materialist frameworks that assumed consciousness was purely biological. Their willingness to risk professional credibility by sharing experiences that contradicted their previous beliefs added weight to their testimonies. The phenomenon extends beyond individual cases to documented instances of shared death experiences where multiple witnesses claim to observe supernatural events simultaneously. Hospice workers and family members have reported seeing deceased relatives appear to dying patients, witnessing unexplained lights or energy patterns at the moment of death, and experiencing their own consciousness displacement during terminal care situations. Raymond Moody, the physician who coined the term near-death experience, has documented hundreds of cases where healthy individuals at the bedside of dying patients report experiencing their own out-of-body sensations and witnessing otherworldly phenomena. These shared experiences involve multiple witnesses observing the same impossible events simultaneously, potentially addressing skeptical concerns about individual hallucinations. In one documented case, an entire family watching over their dying grandmother reported seeing deceased relatives appear in the room and escort the dying woman toward a brilliant light. The witnesses included medical professionals, religious skeptics, and children too young to have preconceived notions about death. All provided consistent descriptions of events that conventional science couldn't explain. The cumulative weight of these medical and witness cases suggests something extraordinary may be occurring during the dying process that transcends normal biological functions. The consistency of reports across cultures, professions, and belief systems indicates either a universal neurological phenomenon or genuine glimpses into consciousness survival after physical death. Our fifth case takes us into even stranger territory, with the claims of individuals who report not just witnessing the afterlife, but actually communicating with deceased consciousness that provided them with verifiable information about the living world. These cases challenge the boundary between temporal displacement and direct communication with the dead. Alison Dubois became famous as the inspiration for the television series Medium, but her claims about communication with deceased consciousness go far beyond entertainment value. According to Dubois, she doesn't simply receive vague impressions from the dead. Instead, she claims to experience temporal displacement, where deceased individuals transport her consciousness to witness events from their lives and deaths directly. Dubois describes these experiences as more than psychic readings or intuitive impressions. She claims that deceased consciousness can literally pull her awareness backward through time to witness historical events, murders, and personal moments that occurred before her birth. These temporal journeys allegedly provide her with detailed information that she later uses to solve criminal cases and provide closure to grieving families. What makes Dubois particularly interesting is her work with law enforcement agencies and the verifiable accuracy of information she provides. Police departments have documented cases where she provided specific details about crime scenes, victim experiences, and perpetrator actions that weren't publicly available. Her descriptions often include temporal elements, where she claims to witness events unfolding from the perspective of deceased victims. The mechanism Dubois describes for these temporal communications challenges conventional understanding of both consciousness and time. According to her account, deceased awareness exists in a state where past events remain accessible and observable. The dead can guide living consciousness to witness historical events directly, essentially using temporal displacement as a form of evidence gathering. Dubois claims that deceased individuals maintain emotional connections to unsolved crimes, unresolved family issues, and traumatic events that anchor their consciousness to specific temporal locations. These anchoring points allow them to transport living awareness to witness past events and gather information that can be used to resolve outstanding issues in the present. The accuracy of information Dubois obtains through these alleged temporal communications has been documented by multiple law enforcement agencies. In several cases, she provided details about murder victims and crime scenes that led directly to arrests and convictions. The specificity of this information and its verifiable nature suggest either extraordinary investigative abilities or genuine communication with deceased consciousness. Similar claims come from other individuals who report temporal displacement experiences during communication with the dead. These cases involve people who had no previous interest in paranormal phenomena, but suddenly began experiencing what they describe as consciousness travel, to witness past events under the guidance of deceased relatives or friends. The pattern that emerges from these cases is remarkably consistent. Individuals report that deceased consciousness retains the ability to perceive and revisit past events and can occasionally share this capability with living people through various forms of temporal displacement. The dead aren't simply existing in some static afterlife realm, but remain actively engaged with temporal reality in ways that transcend normal physical limitations. What makes these communication cases particularly compelling is their practical applications and verifiable outcomes. Unlike abstract philosophical discussions about consciousness survival, These experiences produce concrete information that can be tested against objective reality. When individuals claim to witness past events under the guidance of deceased consciousness and provide details that prove accurate, it suggests something extraordinary may be occurring. The temporal mechanics described by these communicators align remarkably well with the accounts provided by near-death experiencers and alleged time travelers. All describe consciousness existing outside linear time, the ability to observe multiple temporal periods simultaneously, and the capacity for awareness to transcend normal physical limitations. These convergent testimonies from diverse sources create a compelling picture of consciousness as something far more complex and durable than conventional science assumes. Whether through technological displacement, near-death experiences, or direct communication, multiple independent sources describe awareness as capable of surviving physical death and operating according to temporal rules that transcend normal chronological limitations. The convergence of these testimonies creates an unsettling pattern that defies conventional explanation. Whether we're examining internet profits, documented disappearances, or medical professionals reporting impossible experiences, the same fundamental claims keep emerging. Consciousness appears to survive physical death and operates according to temporal rules that make linear time meaningless. Our sixth case introduces us to Mike Markham, known as Madman Markham, whose amateur attempts at time travel resulted in his mysterious disappearance and alleged encounters with deceased consciousness in future timelines. Unlike the polished accounts of medical professionals or the technical sophistication of John Titor, Markham's story emerged from the world of underground radio and fringe experimentation. In 1995, Markham called into the Coast to Coast AM radio show with Art Bell, claiming he had discovered a method for temporal displacement using electrical equipment stolen from his local power company. His device, based on what he called a Jacob's ladder configuration, had allegedly succeeded in sending small objects and animals through time. But according to Markham, his experiments had revealed something far more significant than simple temporal travel. Markham claimed that during his early experiments, he had made contact with what he described as consciousness entities from future time periods. These beings, according to his account, were human personalities that had died in various historical periods, but continued to exist in a state he called temporal consciousness. They had allegedly guided him in constructing his time travel device and warned him about the dangers of temporal displacement. The entities Markham described weren't traditional spirits or ghosts. Instead, they appeared to be deceased human consciousness that had somehow become integrated with the fabric of time itself. According to his claims, these temporal beings could observe events across multiple time periods simultaneously and possessed knowledge of future developments that they occasionally shared with living individuals. What made Markham's case particularly compelling was his technical knowledge of electrical systems and his documented arrest for stealing power transformers from the St. Joseph Light and Power Company in King City, Missouri. Police records confirmed that his experiments had caused a local blackout, suggesting that whatever he was doing involved substantial electrical manipulation that went beyond simple hoax attempts. After his release from jail, Markham continued his experiments and called the radio show again in 1996. This time, he claimed to have achieved a limited success in sending himself through time for brief periods. During these temporal jumps, he alleged encountering deceased relatives who existed in what he described as a consciousness network spanning multiple time periods. According to Markham's final radio appearance, the deceased consciousness he encountered had revealed that death was not an ending, but a transformation into a higher form of temporal existence. The dead, he claimed, became part of the underlying structure of time itself, gaining the ability to observe and influence events across past, present, and future simultaneously. Markham's descriptions of these temporal consciousness entities aligned remarkably well with accounts from other alleged time travelers. He described beings that retained their human personalities and memories while possessing capabilities that transcended normal physical limitations. These entities could manipulate probability outcomes, guide living individuals towards specific decisions, and occasionally facilitate temporal displacement for selected people. The most disturbing aspect of Markham's claims was his warning about what he called temporal consciousness recruitment. According to his account, deceased beings were actively seeking living individuals who could serve as temporal anchors, allowing the dead to influence events in the physical world more directly. Time travel technology, he claimed, was being developed specifically to create these anchor connections. In early 1997, Markham announced on the radio show that he was nearly ready to test his completed time travel device on himself. He claimed that the deceased consciousness entities had provided him with specific instructions for a temporal journey that would allow him to witness the true nature of existence after death. That was his final public communication. Markham disappeared shortly afterward and has never been seen or heard from again. These 10 extraordinary cases force us to confront an uncomfortable reality that science cannot yet explain. Whether elaborate hoaxes or genuine glimpses beyond death's veil, they consistently describe consciousness surviving physical existence and operating outside linear time. Perhaps death isn't humanity's final chapter, but our first step into something far more complex and mysterious than we ever imagined.